Hello again everybody, and welcome back to my workshop for another of Harry's Jeti Clinic videos. And in this video we are going to look at the Central Box 320. There it is. Now at the time of making this video, which is the 7th December 2021, this is very new. It's only been on sale for a couple of days, I think. So we're going to look at what it can do, how you set about getting it programmed, and if you're getting this whilst it's still fairly new, an error message that you are likely to encounter and what to do about it. If you're using one somewhat later in time, then a transmitter update has likely taken account of the error. What I'm going to be using with it is a pair of satellites, the RSAT2 for receivers, and the RC switch, the radio controlled switch. It also comes with the usual mounting kit and these handy little bars which screw down into these little holes here, and these bars on little mounts can hold your servo plugs firmly in place if you've got a model with, say, a petrol engine that suffers a lot of vibration. Okay. So there's a Central Box 310 and there's a Central Box 320. What's the difference? The 310 does not have any fuses on the servo outputs. The 320 does. You'll see some of the outputs are marked in yellow, some in red. The fuses on the ones in red are higher current than the ones in yellow. And the instructions say that the ones in yellow are good for servos up to 30 kg/cm of torque, and the ones in red are good for up to 60 kg/cm of torque. If you don't want fuses, get the 310. If the fuse blows, as it were, it will automatically reset itself once it cools down. We've got two battery inputs. You don't need to use both, you can just use one. As you can see, the input voltage anywhere from 6 to 14, sort of 2 to 3S lithium, or relevant nickel batteries. The output to the servos is voltage regulated, and you can choose from 5 through to 8.4 volts, so anything from standard up to high voltage servos. And Jeti suggests that if you want to maintain a full sort of 8.4 volts at the servo outputs, then you should plug in a 3S rather than a 2S lithium, because obviously it can't put out more than it's getting in. So if you plug in a 2S lithium, you're pretty soon going to be down to 8 volts, 7.5 volts, and you couldn't maintain 8.4 volts, I should say, at the outputs. So you do have that option. Always remember then that if you set the output to 8.4 volts, you're not going to get that if you plug in a 2S lithium battery, which is now going to be down to 8.2, then 8, then 7.8 volts, and so on. Up at the top here, we've got sockets for standard 2 receivers in double path mode. A socket here, which can be expander port 1 or receiver 3, if you're using the 900 megahertz. Switch, in this case it would be the radio control switch, or you can plug in the magnetic switch. If you don't plug a switch in, it will default to being on. That's part of its failsafe. Should anything happen to a switch disconnected, wire pulled out, it just will be on. And then you've got further expander ports, which can be for XBUS out, telemetry in, that sort of thing. Okay, that's a rough run through of what it can do. What sort of size is it? Well, it's about that size. There you go. Quite a neat little unit. And as you can see, does up to 18 servos. Okay, now what I'm going to do is take you through the process of binding 2 satellite receivers to it and then the switch. Now I've covered these in previous videos about the Central Box 200 series and the Central Box 400, but I make no apologies for going through it again, because maybe a Central Box 300 is your first Central Box, and also because the process still causes some people a little bit of confusion. In fact, there's one particular question comes up constantly on Facebook groups, forums, or people sending me messages saying, why does the telemetry say all my receivers have lost signal when I only unplug one of them? and that's a setting in the transmitter when you haven't actually lost signal. It's just the way it gives you the data. So we'll go right through the process again very quickly. I'll just do the 2 RSATs. I won't do the 900. That's been covered in other videos, and the process is much the same. Okay, let's get going. I'll pop the camera on here for a moment. And what we want to do is go into our menu, Advanced Properties. I do apologise if there's a lot of background noise. One of our winter storms is passing through at the moment. So into our wireless modes, we'll change it to double path. Ready to pair the primary module, we'll press the button. Okay, let's go over here and have a look. You've got to be careful to do one receiver at a time, because if there's 2 receivers powered up and running, the transmitter won't really know what to do. So we take one of our receivers, we've put the bind plug into the EXT socket, so we've put a power lead into the PPM socket. I'll plug it in to one of the receiver sockets here, although to be honest I think you could plug it into a servo socket. All it wants is power. That's all it's after at the moment. And then I take my Jeti power ion, of course. What else for battery would I use? And we'll plug that in. There we go. There's power to the beast. We'll come back here. And now I'm going to press the programming dial.
Range test.
Really, is this receiver? Yes. That's that receiver bound. Okay. I'll come down, but I'm not going to press the programming dial yet, because if I do that, it's going to try and pair the secondary module to the same receiver. So it's very important to unplug that one so that it's not powered anymore. Get your other receiver, put your bind plug over, I may have to put the camera down for a moment because doing this single-handed is not good. Back with you in a second. Okay, back over here. So this is our second one. Again, doesn't matter if we plug it back into R1, it's not doing anything at the moment other than giving it power. So we'll plug it in. Back here. Now we want to pair the secondary module.
Range test.
Yes. There we are.
Telemetry lost.
Now what I will do is remove the bind plug. I'll move that secondary receiver over to R2. I'll plug the first one that we did back into R1.
Telemetry lost.
Okay. Now, another thing we want to do here, and this is the one that causes so many people a problem. Alarm at loss of any receiver. Now, if you go through the procedure to disable the first RF output or the second RF output to the second receiver in order to test the failover strategy, what would happen on your front display where it shows the A values and the Q value is that both receivers will go to 0 out of 9 on both aerials, and your Q will go to 0, but the system would still be working. And the reason for that is simply the setting here. Change it to loss of both receivers. And now, if one receiver gets unplugged or you disable transmitter 1, so you're running on the other receiver, the main display will show the other receiver still at 9 on or whatever value on its aerials and Q of 100% or whatever the Q is. So that's an important one. This was one that I get so many questions about. Even though it's been mentioned in the other videos, it just catches people out a lot. So my recommendation is change it to loss of both receivers. If you prefer an alarm at loss of one receiver or a specific receiver, that's fine, but just realize that the front telemetry display, if you put it on, you choose to display telemetry of the antenna values, is going to be a little bit misleading. Okay, next what we're going to do is, of course at the moment the receivers are plugged into the PPM socket and I want to use XBUS. XBUS doesn't come out the PPM socket, it comes out of the EXT socket. So I'm now going to change the leads over to XBUS on both of those. Okay, and let's have a look at them. So we'll come back to the switch in a moment, say OK to that. We need to go into Device Explorer. There's our two RSATs. So let's look in there. The serial link, we need to set it to XBUS and PPM positive. Yes.
Warning.
And that's told the satellite to put XBUS on the EXT socket. Okay. General settings, output period, I will put to auto, which means it just follows the 100 or 50 megahertz that we've set in the transmitter. You should really be using 100 megahertz. The others don't matter. Low voltage alarms, okay. Failsafe should be disabled. Good. And that's it for that. So we can say OK to that one. Now that it's running in XBUS, it can see a central box 320. Come down to the second receiver. Again, set it to XBUS and PPM positive. Yes. And it tells you here that because we've selected XBUS and PPM positive, it's going to put the PPM or UDI on which pin, i.e. which socket on the receiver, the PPM socket. And the Jeti box or EXBUS pin is going to be on the X socket, which is why I moved the cable over to the EXT socket, because I knew that's where it was going to put the XBUS. Okay, general settings again, output period, set that to auto. Back. Check that the failsafe is disabled. Remember, if you're using a central box, it's always the central box you set the failsafe, not the receivers. You must not set failsafe in the receiver, otherwise the central box will never be able to do its job. And say OK to that. And let's now go and do the RC switch. And so I need to plug the bind plug into the EXT socket of the RC switch. Let's go into this, tell it to be enabled, plug the RC switch in to the central box. It's got a little flashing light, pair it, searching, it's done. And this little red LED has come on. Can we see it there? Yeah, to say that it's active. Take the bind plug out. I need to set a switch for it. What shall I have? Something I don't normally use. I'll try switch SC here. And I'll move it to the down position. OK to that. Inverted polarity, I don't think so. Audio switched on. What shall we have? I doubt if I've got an on here. No. I shall have to make a receiver switched on, I think. Yeah, okay, so I've nothing to set on there and I haven't got anything for the off switch. Okay, so we'll press OK to that. Now, if I operate the switch SC, it should all go off. Shut down the model. Say yes. If you don't, it'll time out and remain on. This is its fail-safing. So I'll move the switch back to the on position. So even if you accidentally nudge the switch, and I think normally I would use, say, the locking switch for it, it's not going to go off unless you confirm it. And they are very short range as well. So it's unless you're close by, it won't work. So when you're normal flying around, it can't work. So we'll say, shut the model down, say yes.
Warning, low voltage.
There we go. It's all gone off. There you can see
Lost.
it's losing it. I'll switch it back on, turn the model on. I'll say yes. If we left it to time out, it would remain at the off state. Remember, the timeout as it counts down will always fail back to whatever state it's on at the moment, whether it's off or whether it's on. Right, now let's go to the Central Box 320, and this is where I'm anticipating an error message. There we are. Aha, I was right. Unable to open configuration. And the reason for this is that any device that appears here in Device Explorer must have a corresponding file for it in the Devices folder on the card in the transmitter. And because this has only been out for 2 or 3 days, maybe even only a couple of days, and my transmitter hasn't been updated for a few months, there wasn't a Central Box 320 device full file on Jeti Studio for the transmitter to update with. So what we need to do is go to Studio and get the update file. And if you're watching this video sometime well out in the future, chances are if you've done an update, it's picked up the file for you, and so you wouldn't get that error message. So let's pop over to the computer and see how we can get that device folder without doing a complete firmware update, which takes a long time and is a big download. Okay, here we are in Jeti Studio, and this should be normally the place to get the device file. But Jeti is a bit slow. They haven't put the device file onto Studio yet, so we have to go and get it from their website. But let's have a little look at how you'd do it through Studio. You'd want to make sure that Studio is right up to date itself. So go to Help, check for updates. Say Studio is at the latest version, and it says we have the latest definition of device updates, the lastest definition. Which, yes, okay, Studio is up to date, but Jeti hasn't updated Studio, so the device folder isn't there. Let's have a look. Transmitter Wizard. You'd go to Transmitter Update. Next. I'm already on version 5.06. The latest version is that, so you could select it, say Next. I'll skip the backup. And basically, you could untick everything. So all it's going to do is put on the update, which you've already got, but it will re-update the transmitter, and all the device folders, device files I should say, not folders, and then press update. And it would run through all the devices, but it doesn't have the 310 or the 320 in there yet. So how do we get it? Well, not through Studio, sadly. What we need to do is go to Jeti's website, jetimodel.com. Bizarrely, the products central box takes you to the wrong page completely. What we need to do is come down here to Products, Central Box. Choose your central box, whether you got a 310 or a 320. You can put both of them in. They're different device files. Central Box 320. Go to the downloads, and there we are, the configuration file for the 320. So if we download that, there we go. Go to our file manager, there it is. I'll copy that, and I go to my transmitter, which is already plugged in through the USB drive. There we are, down to devices, and I can simply paste it in. There we go, it's in there, hurrah. So now I can disconnect the transmitter USB, and we'll go back to the transmitter. Okay, we've successfully obtained the device file. We've put it onto the transmitter. Now let's find out if that works. Use the switch to switch it on. Good.
Warning, low voltage.
No, it's not. Go into there, device explorer. There's our central box 320. Now, will we get into it? Hooray! General settings. Output period, auto. If you set the output period to auto in any of Jeti's receivers, central boxes, what it means is it will use the output period from the transmitter's frequency. And you can set the transmitter's data frequency to 100 Hertz or 50 Hertz, which equates to sort of servo timings of 10 milliseconds or 20 milliseconds. You really ought to run the transmitter at 100 Hertz. And if you use auto here, it's going to output that, which means a 10 millisecond timing to the servos, which is fine for most digital servos, but many analog servos would suffer. Why would Jeti provide you with a 50 Hertz setting in the transmitter? That's for backward compatibility with very old Jeti receivers in which you cannot set the output period, and it would just pass on the transmitter's 100 Hertz, which would not be good for your analog servos. So use auto here, fine if you're running digital servos which could cope with 10 milliseconds. Otherwise, change it to something that suits your servos. If you've got good old-fashioned analog stuff, 20, 19, 17, 20, 21, 22 is fine. Okay, or you can manually set it down at 10. That would equate to auto with the transmitter running 100. Okay, expander settings. You've got your various things there. XBUS is XBUS out. Yep. E2. Why did that one have receiver? Ah, yes, receiver. That is the socket expander 1/receiver 3. So if you were using the 900 megahertz receiver plugged in there, you'd set it to receiver. E2. You can have telemetry in, XBUS out or SBUS out for those of you who want that. Just telemetry or XBUS out. E4, telemetry input, Jeti box out, XBUS out. There, the receiver inputs, it's jumped over. The reason is you don't get to set those. They are auto-sensing. R1 and R2 sense what kind of data is coming in. Now, I plugged in RSATs set to XBUS, and therefore it's auto-sensed it's getting XBUS data. If I'd plugged them in using PPM data, it would have sensed that and used PPM. I think it can also sense UDI and I think SBUS as well, but you'd have to check your instructions for that. Now, the switchover strategy, this is very important. You can choose from 80, 150 or mixing. And what the switchover strategy is which receiver it's listening to. If you use a timeout, 80 or 150 milliseconds, it listens just to the receiver that's plugged into the port R1. And it will listen to that alone. It won't listen to receiver 2 until either 80 or 150 milliseconds of no data is received, and then it will switch over to receiver 2, and it will listen to receiver 2 for as long as receiver 2 is providing it data. And then if it's still getting no data on 1, and then it gets no data on 2, it'll go over to its failsafe, not the failover. If after a timeout on receiver 1, it's gone over to receiver 2, and then receiver 1 starts producing data again, valid data, it'll switch back to receiver 1 immediately. Yeah, so it'll switch over to receiver 2 for just as long as it needs until receiver 1 is working again. Mixing looks at both receiver 1 and receiver 2. Now, in a perfect world, they'll both be putting out exactly the same data to the central box because they're both receiving the same data, if it's valid. If it sees it's only getting valid packets from one of them, it will use the one that's giving it the valid packets. Now here's a very important thing. What if receiver 1 and receiver 2 were giving it different data? Now it's going to get confused, and that's why you should never use the mixing failover strategy. If you have a gyro receiver such as the Assist or what do you call them, the Bavarian Demon Cortex Pros, plugged into the receiver channels, because imagine you have an Assist receiver with gyro output plugged into receiver 1 and a satellite plugged into receiver 2. The Assist is going to be putting out gyro modified data, and the satellite is going to be putting out unmodified data, and they're going to be different. And the central box is going to go, whoa, which one of these do I use? So never use mixing when you're putting a gyro into a receiver socket. If you're using a gyro on the servo outputs, such as you're outputting to the old-fashioned Cortex Pro, or you're outputting to a Powerbox I gyro, for instance, coming out of the receiver sockets, then it's perfectly okay to use mixing on the receiver inputs. It's when there's a gyro somewhere on the receiver input. Never use mixing, use a timeout. And which timeout you would use is entirely your choice. Would it go for 80 milliseconds with no data on receiver 1 before it switches to receiver 2? Or would it go for 150 milliseconds? I'd tend to go for that one myself, but it's your choice. Okay, now here's where you can set your output voltages, anywhere from 5 to 8.4 volts. Remember, you can't get more voltage out than you're putting in, so you can select 8.4 volts, but if you plug in a lithium polymer or a lithium ion battery and it's a 2S, you're probably only going to start with about 8.3, if you're lucky 8.4 volts, and rapidly drop down 8.2, 8.1, 7 point something volts. So if you genuinely want 8.4 volts at the output all the time, you're going to have to use a 3S battery. Okay, and that's it for that. Trying to get the back button. Alternative pin config. These are now like any other central box. You can choose a servo output, digital out or digital in. These are for basically logic switching. I've got a video covering that somewhere, I think. Or a DTEC servo. Those are the servos that can provide telemetry. So if you want to use those, you have to change the socket to a DTEX rather than simply servo. Otherwise it won't recognize the servo telemetry. Okay, back of it. Servo failsafes. This is where you always set failsafe in a central box, never on the receivers themselves. Failsafe enabled. What delay do you want? Come down here, and for each socket, change what you want it to do. Will it hold the last position? Go to off on that servo. What that means is not the power off, but the data will go off. And things like jet engine ECUs or electric model speed controllers would often be programmed to recognize that if they receive no data, they shut down the motor. So any decent electric speed controller would shut off the motor. Any decent jet engine ECU would shut down the jet engine on receiving that. Or you can go to an actual programmed failsafe. My preference is to go for a failsafe rather than rely on whether or not the speed controller you've bought, especially if it's some cheap one, will actually do the safe thing. I simply don't trust cheap, shall we say, Far Eastern goods. Not that I buy them anyway, but if you like to use them, I would suggest you want to use a guaranteed failsafe. And then you go up to set your failsafe positions now, apply changes, and it will do it. What I would like to see Jeti do is provide an option here to set all of them to the same thing. Otherwise, you've got to go through all 18, setting them to failsafe. Okay. Say OK to that. Come out of there. The you can remap in any Jeti receiver or central box the incoming channel to which socket you want it to go to. So by default, channel 1 goes to socket 1, or as Jeti calls them, out pin 1. And channel 2 would go to out pin 2, channel 3 to out pin 3, but you can remap it if you want. So you can remap your throttle coming in on channel 1 to out pin 4 if you want. And blah, blah, blah. Personally, I think you're better to do it in the servo assignment rather than remapping stuff here. And the reason for that is just trying to keep track of what's what. Because if you go to your servo assignment and you're looking for a servo and it says it's on channel 5, if you've remapped your receiver or central box, it's not coming out of socket 5. So if you find yourself a faulty servo and you're trying to backtrack, you can get really lost. So that's just my personal preference. You can do what you like with it if you prefer to do it that way. Telemetry, this tells you internal temperature, not your workshop temperature or your airfield temperature, the internal temperature of the device. And that's always likely to be higher than ambient because, of course, you've got electric current flowing through it. Why bother showing it? Well, it can be rather handy because, of course, if you look up your instruction manual, you'll find there's a maximum and minimum operating temperatures. And if you live in a country where you get sunshine, which doesn't really bother us too much in Britain, but if you get sunshine and high temperatures and you've got a black canopy or cover over the model, it can get very hot in there, and the internal temperature of the device can rise to the point where the electronics will start shutting down. And so it's useful to be able to know that. No shorted outputs, and here's the current voltage. Current, I've only got one battery plugged in going through. Output volts is down to 8.1 because the input volt is 8.1. Remember I said you can't set an output voltage. Well, you can set an output voltage higher than the input, but you ain't going to get it. And there's the status of the fuses on each of the sockets. Okay. Now this is an interesting one, the telemetry min-max. You can clear the minimum and maximum values. Okay, just by saying clear now, and it will do it. You can also set a switch. And what it will do then is clear out the minimum and maximum values and it'll start counting them again. It doesn't have a milliamp counter, which is a pity. And to do that, you simply go in there and select a switch in the normal manner. You don't have to set up a function or a channel to do it. It sort of gets this data secretly through a little back channel of some sort, which is very useful if you've got something like Central Box that records the milliamp hours. Unfortunately, this one isn't doing it because then you can run your milliamp hours through the day off your battery. Okay. And does that one give it to you? Yeah, it tells you there. Okay, and so there you go. That is a quick run through the Central Box 300 series. Hope you have fun with that, folks.